Hello everyone, welcome to my fourth and final video in my video series on Home Assistant. Today I'm going to be talking about automations and scripts. So starting with automations. Automations are basically when you have Home Assistant perform an action at a certain event. And this event could be time-based or state-based, and we'll see more examples as we go on. So there's two ways to configure automations within Home Assistant. You can do it using the configuration files, which is my preferred method, or you can do it using the user interface. For the sake of completeness, let's talk about both, starting with using the user interface. So to do that, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go in configurations here, and we're going to click on automations. And to create a new automation, we'll click add automation. Now Home Assistant provides this new feature where it's called blueprints, where it's going to try to create an automation for you. Let's not get too reliant on this. So let's instead click on start with an empty automation. So with any new automation, the first thing we're going to want to do is give it a name. So for this example, I'm going to create an automation that will turn on my outdoor lights at 8 p.m. every day. So I'm going to call this turn on outdoor lights. And I should probably not use spaces here. And then I can also give it a description so I can easily identify what my automations does. And this becomes useful when you get a lot of automations. So this one just turns on outdoor lights at 8 p.m. After giving our automation a name and a description, the next thing we want to configure is a trigger. So the trigger is what needs to happen for the automation to activate. And in this case, we want the automation to activate at 8 p.m. So the trigger needs to be a time-based trigger. So if I click here, I have a few different options, and the relevant one is time. And I want the trigger to be a fixed time, which is 8 o'clock. So the syntax for this is actually 20:00, which is 8 o'clock. I can also specify the seconds, but in this case, it's not necessary. So that's the trigger. Next up is conditions. And the conditions is under what conditions should the automation activate. This is optional, and if you leave this blank, it means the automation always activates. So in this example, maybe I don't want the lights to turn on the weekends. I only want this automation to happen on the weekdays. So I can set a condition there. But for this example, let's leave it blank, and I'll come back to a few more examples where I do show conditions. And the last, of course, is the action. So what needs to happen once the trigger occurs. And in this case, the trigger is 8 p.m. and the action should be, I want the lights to turn on. So it's a device type. The action type is device. The device is outside lights. And I want them to turn on. And that's all I need. So these options are optional. And I click save. And this should add my automation. Now, if I go back here to automations, I actually see this automation show up here. And it was last triggered never because I just added this automation. And I can actually turn this automation on and off from here. So if I turn the automation off, now the automation won't happen. My lights won't turn on when the trigger occurs. And this can come in handy. Say if I'm going on vacation and I don't want my lights to turn on and off, I can actually turn the automation off without deleting the automation. So that's how you add automations using the user interface. So next up, I'm going to show you how to add automations using the configuration files. And for that, the first thing we do is we're going to go to the documentations for automations in Home Assistant. So in the new tab here, I'm going to type in Home Assistant automations into Google. And I'm going to click on the second link, Automating Home Assistant. And here it goes through the user interface for creating automations in Home Assistant, just like I went over. But at the bottom, there's actually separate documentation for triggers, conditions, and actions. So briefly going through each one of these, let's start with triggers. Here it lists all the possible triggers that you can use. So we just use the time trigger. There's also state triggers, numeric state triggers, sun triggers, generic template triggers, and a few other examples. So the most relevant ones are, of course, time triggers and state and numeric state triggers, since those are the ones that we'll be using most often. So if I just click on time trigger here, it actually gives us the syntax for the using a time trigger. So let's try to create the same automation we just created, but this time using the configuration files. So if I go back to Home Assistant, I have to click on File Editor, and then I have to go back to my configuration file, which is right here, configurations.yaml. It's already open. And here we see our automation configuration option. And what Home Assistant has done by default is it's referencing this file called automations.yaml. So it's saying whatever is in the file automations.yaml, include it here in this automation configuration. And this allows us to split up the configuration files into smaller chunks so it's more manageable. So all the automations will be added to this automations.yaml file, which will be referenced in this configuration file. So I click here, and we can see that Home Assistant has automatically added the configuration we added using the user interface. So if I wanted to add the same configuration using the configuration file itself, what I would do is first I would press hyphen here, and hyphen basically it adds another entry to this list of automations. So here I can start specifying my options, and actually I've already done this, so I don't waste too much time just writing it out. So this is the automation I would create. So I would specify the ID, which is turn on outdoor lights YAML, which is different from this because this one we configured using the user interface. This one we're going to configure using YAML. The alias is just more of a descriptive name. So turn on outdoor lights at 8 p.m. Configured using YAML. Of course, you wouldn't specify this usually. The trigger is a platform trigger. It's a time at 8 p.m. And I can get this syntax from here. So what I did was I copied this. I copy pasted this over here. Oops. And just get the spacing right. And I specify the time correctly. So this was 20:00. And that's one of the big advantages of using the configuration files is you can copy paste stuff easier. And then I specify the action. So the action, recall from my last video, I talked about services. Most actions, with a few exceptions, are going to be service calls. And in this case, the service I want to call is light.turnOn. And to call this service, I need to specify some data, which is the entity ID, or which light do I want to turn on. So in this case, it's light.outside lights. So this is my automation. I specified an ID, an alias, a trigger, for which I just use the documentation here for the syntax, and the action. And the action is almost always going to be a service call, so it's always the same syntax. You specify the service, and then you specify the data for the service. Refer to my last video, part 3 for services. So if I click save here, and I go back to configurations, I'll need to do a restart to reload the configuration files. And since we just made a change to automations, I don't have to restart all of Home Assistant. I can just restart the automations here. So I've restarted automations. And if I go back to automations, it should be added here using YAML. So that was time-based triggers. Another trigger that we're going to use a lot of times is either a state trigger or a numeric state trigger. So let's do another example with a state trigger. And what a state trigger is it triggers an automation when some entity changes states. So recall from my last video I talked about states. For this example, let's do an automation where every time I turn on my TV, the light in my bedroom turns off. Right. So the trigger in this case will need to be a state trigger. The entity will be my TV, and it will need to change from off to on. And this from is optional. I can just specify the on here. So I'm going to copy this. I'm going to go back to my file editor. I'm going to add a new automation. Let's call this turn light off TV. I'll give it an alias. Turn light off with TV on. And I'm going to give it a trigger. So I just copy pasted from the documentation. Adjust the spacing. So the platform is state, the entity ID. So I don't have two entities here like they did in the documentation. I just have one. And if I recall from my last video, I believe my TV was called Media Player Sharp TV. And the state needs to change from, well, I'm not going to specify a from. I'm just going to say to on. Now, one thing to know here is you actually need to be careful of what that state is actually called. And this is done if you refer again to my last video where I talked about the developer tools and I talked about entities and states. If I look up the TV, Sharp TV, the state here is off. And this is exactly what I need to enter into the automations. So OFF. If I turn the TV on, it will say ON, and that's what I'll need to enter. Depending on the entity, the state might be different. So for example, well, this one's unknown. Yeah, for the state for this notification is notifying. The state for this sensor is a number, and so on, right? So you need to make sure that you match whatever the state here is with what you enter in your automation. So once we've done that, the next thing is we're gonna give the action, and actually the action is just light.turnoff, and I've specified that here, so it's easy for me to just copy and paste this. Which again, this is one of the bigger advantages of using the automation, the configuration files. I want the lights to turn off, and it's instead of outside light, I want to change this to Armin bedroom lights. Hit the save button. Hopefully I don't have any syntax errors. Go back to configurations, server control, and reload automations. So this automation we can actually test out. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn on the lights in my bedroom. I'm going to go to developer tools here, states, Armin bedroom lights. You can see they're on. And I'm going to turn on my TV from my phone. So I'm going to turn it on now. So let's see if the lights turn off. And you can see there's going to be a possible delay. So you saw that delay. And this goes back to my second video about IoT classes. And the reason is the TV is a local polling type service. So that means Home Assistant has to continually poll it every 10 seconds to see if it's been turned on or off. So there was actually a delay between the time I turned it on and by the time Home Assistant noted. So, in this case, I just want the lights to turn off when the TV turns on. It's not a big deal if there's a few seconds delay. But for something more mission critical, this may be an issue. So you definitely want to keep that in mind when making your automations. So now I'm going to do one last example, and let's make this example a bit more complicated. So this one, I want to talk about, first of all, conditions. And I also want to demonstrate that you can use not just states, but also their attributes. So you can define automations based on the attributes of an entity, or a state attribute of an entity. So for this example, let's do something like this. So I have a receiver attached to my Home Assistant, and the current volume level is 30%. So I'm going to create an automation that anytime the volume goes over 80%, so 0.8, then my lights flash on and off a few times to let me know that the volume is too high. And the condition is I only want this to activate after a certain time. When people may be sleeping in my house. So say if it's after 10 p.m., people may be sleeping. I don't want the volume to get too high. So I'm going to create an automation that if the volume goes above 0.8 after 10 p.m., then flash the lights on and off so that I know the volume is too high. So let's go back to our file editor here. And let's create a new automation. Let's give it the ID volume too high. And let's give it an alias. We'll just give it the same alias, volume too high. So the trigger for this is, it's a state trigger, but this time it's a numeric state trigger and it's based on an attribute. So I'm going to go back to the automations trigger documentation for Home Assistant. And this one here is a numeric state trigger because the volume is a numerical value. And here it actually gives me example for how I would syntax what I want to do. So in this example for here, we have state.attribute.battery. That's great because I can just copy this type of trigger, paste it to my automations file, getting the spacing right. And the platform is numeric state. The entity ID in my case is media player. And I believe it was called Denon X3400H. The value template is state.attribute.volume. Actually, it may just be better to open up the developer tools in a new tab and type in the receiver here. It actually was not called Denon, it was called family room receiver. So I'm going to copy this, paste this here to the entity ID. And the state attribute that I'm concerned with is called volume level. So I'm going to copy this here, volume level. And if it goes above 0.8, that's when the trigger should happen. And actually, for this example, let's do 0.5 so it's easier to test. And below, okay, this one is not relevant here. So that's our trigger. Next up is condition. So I have to specify the condition. And I'm going to do the same thing that I did with the trigger, which is go to the documentation. And in the documentation here, it gives us a different option. So we have and condition, or condition. In our case, it's a time condition, state condition. It's not listed at the top here, but there we go, time condition. So again, I'm just going to copy this example here. So this is they have an alias here. We don't need that. The condition is time after a certain time. So I believe in my example, I said 10 o'clock. So let's paste this, get the spacing right. Condition, condition time. And after 22, right? So that's my condition. And finally, well, actually the time here is 9:15. So let's change the condition to 21 so it's easier to test. And finally, I want the action to be the lights to turn on and off. So I can just copy this action here. And instead of light.turn on, I'm going to have them toggle. And the lights I want are my bedroom lights. And I want them to turn on and off. So I'm going to have to toggle them a few times. And actually, I can specify multiple actions here. So light.toggle. And let's do it 3 times. So it starts off in the original state. Get the spacing right. And between each one, I'm going to add a delay. To add a delay, we just have delay. Delay, I believe the syntax is just 0, 0, 0, 0, and let's say a 5-second delay. And I'm going to add the delay here as well. Okay, hit save. So this will sequentially toggle the lights, wait 5 seconds, toggle the lights, wait 5 seconds, and then toggle the lights, which is what I want. So I'm going to click save. So I restarted the automations and we can see the automation configured and it showed up here. So let's test this out. Let's go to developer tools and let's type in my bedroom lights, which are currently off. So I'm not going to use my phone to turn up the volume above 50% on my receiver, and let's see if it triggers. And remember, there might be a delay. Okay, there we go. It turned on, wait 5 seconds. It should turn off. There we go. And it should turn on again. And again, there was a little bit of delay because the receiver is a local polling service. Which is, we expect that delay. And again, it's not a big deal in this case, but in certain cases, it may be a big deal, as I mentioned in my second video. So that's automation. Now, the last thing I want to talk about today is scripts. And scripts are fairly simple. So if we go back to our automation here, we can see that we had this thing where we turned on the lights, or we toggled the lights, we waited, then we toggled, we waited, we toggled. So we can see it's a sequence of actions. Which we have, it can get quite long. Basically, what a script is we define this sequence of action as one action, as a script. So instead of, if I wanted to call this sequence of events multiple times, instead of writing it out every time, I can just call that script. So let's copy this. And let's go to, again, the documentation. So scripts, Home Assistant. And here they give us the basic syntax for defining scripts. So we have script, the name of the script, the sequence of events that need to occur, and then a few other options like descriptions, variables, and so on. So you can do a lot with scripts. You can pass variables to them. You can assign stuff. But today I'm just going to talk about a basic script that does one sequence of events. And the way we define scripts is similar to automations. We go to the scripts.yaml file, and to create a new script, we just type in the name of the script or the name we want to give it. So this is flash lights 3 times. So that's this part here. So in this example, they have the script called message temperature. And the next thing we want to do is we want to define the sequence of events. So copy this sequence. I'm going to click save here for a second. And the sequence of events I want is actually in my automations files. So I'm just going to copy it so I don't have to rewrite it. Scripts, .yaml, sequence of events. There we go. And I click save. And now there's other options I can define, like I can give it an alias. I don't need to pass any variables. And there's a few more options here. But this is all we need for now. So I go back to configurations, go back to server control, and this time I'm going to restart my scripts. And we can see if scripts showed up from the developer tool. So let's see if this worked. There we go, script flash 3 times. And if I run the script from here, my lights are just flashing on and off right now. And I can click cancel. I can stop the script halfway. Now calling a script like this is very easy. So I'm going to go back to the automation, and I'm going to, instead of, so file ladder, automations, oops. So instead of doing it like this, I can just define a single service, and I'm going to call this the service is just script, and then the name of the script, which is a script dot flash lights 3 times. So this should do the same thing, but as you can see, the automation is much shorter. There's no data to pass to this service because there's no data that our script takes in. So let's try this one last time. So I'm going to go to server control, restart the automations, and then to test it out, let's go and see if my lights will toggle. So I'm going to turn the volume on my receiver to 50% from my phone. And there again, there's going to be a delay because of the local polling. But let's see if the lights, there we go. So lights are, and the script is now activating instead of the actions being specified. So that was scripts and automations. So thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video series or found it helpful, please hit the like button. This video series was really meant as a reference or a theoretical introduction to Home Assistant, but it's not until you actually start playing with Home Assistant yourself and trying out automations that you really get to see how powerful Home Assistant can be for your smart home. And also, because the community is so large, you can also take inspiration from what other people have done with Home Assistant. There's a lot of other YouTube channels just based on Home Assistant. And also on this channel, I'll be doing a lot of projects of my own, showing you what I've done with Home Assistant, ranging from home theater automation, security systems, whole home audio, and much more. So if that's something that you're interested in, please hit the subscribe button so you don't miss out on any of my videos.